สวัสดีค่ะ Welcome to this episode of Be My Guest and you're with me สดชื่นลิมเกรียงไกร In today's episode we will be looking at an International Institute on Management Development or IMD World Competitiveness Yearbook. To find out more about the rankings and the yearbook itself, let's hear more about it with our special guest today.In today's episode, we are joined by Professor Arturo Briz, Director of IMD World Competitiveness Center. สวัสดีค่ะ Welcome to the program. First of all, can I let you explain to us a little bit about your organization? What does it do?
Of course. The IMD World Competitiveness Center was founded 29 years ago.And we are the pioneers in world competitiveness.
Okay.
We are an academic think tank that analyzes the competitiveness of countries, tries to help economies to develop further, and provide research and studies on the topic of competitiveness.
I see. So how long have you been producing this yearbook?
So our yearbook was originally published 29 years ago. It has been changing a lot because we have new countries being added to the rankings.And actually next year we mark our 30th anniversary with 63 countries in the ranking.
I see. So what is the objective of this yearbook?
That's a very good question. So the competitiveness is the objective of any economic policy. So what we try to assess is to what extent countries achieve a certain level of prosperity and growth. And then competitiveness refers to how these countries manage their resources and competencies to just create value for society. So it's about regulation, infrastructure, economic policy, values, innovation, and how this all combines to make the economy better off.
I see. But as you know that many countries in the world.Things change rapidly, especially maybe in the Middle East where there's always war.
Yes.
And in Europe where the Brexit. So when things like that happen, do you have to actually change the factors that you have to consider each time?
Yes. Obviously, the world is changing, and especially with technology, is making certain factors somehow irrelevant. 10 years ago, for example, a very important factor for us was the number of fixed telephone lines.in a country. Today, nobody has a fixed telephone line.
Exactly.
And we look much more at mobility and devices and big data. So we try to accommodate to the changes in the economy. As you say also, some countries go into crisis. And one needs to take into account that competitiveness is long term. So we look at the perspective for the country in the long term. So even if the country is today in a massive crisis, can still be very competitive if it has the right pillars. And the opposite. There are countries that are enjoying an amazing economic position today, but that are not competitive because they are not investing in the right infrastructure, for instance. A good example is China. I mean, China is the largest economy in the world today, but it is not even in the top 20 of our rankings because it doesn't have the right institutions, the right regulation, and even the right values to create prosperity in the long run.
I see. So what are the fixed factors that you take into consideration? I know that there is many factors that you take into consideration, but there must be some fixed ones that you need to have in your survey. So what are those?
Our recipe is very simple. So we say, for a country to be competitive, you need three things. First, a good government. So a government that enacts good regulation. Second, an efficient private sector. That is, executives and companies that create jobs and create productive jobs. And third, a good infrastructure. And an infrastructure for us is not just roads and airports. It's also education and health. So when countries have a good infrastructure, then companies can invest and people can get jobs. So these are the three ingredients of competitive economy: a good government, a good private sector, and good infrastructure.
I see. So what is the process of compiling these information? Do you do surveys or how do you do it?
Our team is 7 people in Lausanne, Switzerland.
Only 7 people?
Only 7 people.
Okay.
But we work we work in collaboration with 55 partner institutes
Okay.
in the globe. Our partner institute in Thailand is the Thailand Management Association, for instance.
Okay.
So our network of partners help us collect the data. The data that we use is both hard data, so statistics like GDP growth or investment in education, and also survey data that we
Okay.
conduct every year between January and April among executives in the country.
I
And the
see.
survey, for example, in the case of Thailand, is conducted together with TMA among some executives who are sometimes alumni of IMD, who are a business school, sometimes identified by TMA.
I see. So these rankings, they change every year. And mostly, the top rankings would just stay the same. So what does these rankings tell about each country?
A ranking is a ranking. That is, unfortunately, you don't have an absolute measure of competitiveness for a country. That's why we need to give a relative measure.
Okay.
So what the rankings do not tell us is how much the competitiveness of a country increases. Because it will be the case, it can be the case that a country becomes better, more competitive, but because other countries do it faster, then the country's ranking deteriorates.
Ah, okay.
So one message that we always convey is that not because you fall in the rankings you are more competitive, and not because you increase in the ranking you are necessarily more competitive. So what the rankings tell you is the long-term projection of the country. And these long-term trends are very important. For example, the trend of Thailand in the last 10 years has been quite stable. Thailand has been moving between 20 and 35 position, and it's quite stable.
I see.
And in that sense, that Thailand needs a push to become way, way better.
Become more competitive, in other
Yes.
words. And what about Singapore? Singapore is a small country and it's as top your rankings. And then people might imagine might be United States of America as they have, big country, a big economy. So can you explain why Singapore manages to be on top for 2 years in a row now?
True. It's true that in principle, a larger economy should find it easier to become competitive, because in a large economy like the United States or China, you can diversify the economy, you can have an internal and an external market, you can have a manufacturing and a service sector that are very strong, you can build infrastructure in a very efficient way.
Exactly.
Because in a small country, building a big road is not very productive. But what we find is that in turn, small economies like Singapore or Hong Kong are extremely competitive. I think the reason is different. The reason why small countries excel in competitiveness is that in small countries it is very easy to pass on good regulation and to find social consensus and to set priorities, to find agreements. Because it's a small country, so at the end of the day, decision making is quite easy. If you think about the United States or China, deciding what are the priorities in a large economy is much more difficult. So Singapore is a very simple economy, very small, not replicable, as well we say. Nobody can replicate the Singaporean model, but it's very easy to implement because it has a leadership with a vision. The vision is to grow and become more competitive, and they just decide and do it. So execution is very easy.
Because as it's small, it's
Exactly.
easy to decide. What about India? India is also another big country with a large economy. So what do you think that India needs to do to improve compared to United States and
Yes.
China?
I remember that it was already 13 years ago when I heard the term BRICS for the first time. Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. So India has been a promising economy for many years. What are the advantages of India? It's a very large economy with huge population, very strong internal market and amazing talent, very well prepared people. The problem with India is, I think, twofold. One is infrastructure. It's a country with an underdeveloped network of roads and railroad transportation, but also health and education systems. And second, a very weak financial sector. That is, in India, probably because of its history, the banking sector has not been developed yet. And at the end of the day, companies and individuals and the government, they need money to finance growth. And that has been the major drag in the Indian economy. But if you compare India with China, one of the greatest advantages of India versus China is talent. A you have better prepared employees, better prepared engineers, more advanced technological education than in China, and that has to be a competitive force for
I
the
see.
country.
Well, now we take a short break, but when we come back, we'll talk more.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the program. So now we're already in our second break. And I've also heard that there's a separate report this year, which is about, the technology and, the digital sector of each country. So can you explain to us a little bit more about that?
We have realized in the last years that competitiveness at the end of the day boils down to digital transformation in countries. That is, the only way how the world economy is going to become more productive is by embracing new technology. So we decided to assess the ability of countries to digitally transform themselves and their companies. So this is a ranking that looks primarily at public sector capabilities to make sure that companies adapt to new technology.
I see.
So you can have a country where the environment is extremely good and then companies do not adopt technology, or the reverse. So for us, the objective is to assess the country's preparedness for the future.
I see. So in the previous years, was this factor involved in the first report, but you decided to separate it this year?
Exactly. Somehow it was embedded in the overall competitiveness of a country. Now we're making it more explicit.
I see.
Because I think we highlight also the drivers of digital transformation for a country that we didn't isolate before.
I see. So what's the trends right now? How has it been any different from, let's say, 5 years ago?
I think the digital transformation of a country requires a few ingredients. I think the first ingredient is the right talent, as we discussed earlier. So you need to educate people on technology. The second ingredient is the technology itself. That is, you need to invest in broadband technology, in big data, in artificial intelligence in the country. And the third ingredient is the mindset. So the mindset is the ability of individuals and companies to adapt technology. In the last 5 years, I think you have seen, for example, Thailand is a good example. It's massive improvements in technology. Investment in technology, Wi-Fi, broadband. But what we still miss in many countries is this mindset change, in which basically just individuals and companies realize that digital transformation is a must. It's not a choice anymore. It's like we need to transform our companies and our households and our governments to incorporate technology, because the digital transformation will drive everything that we are now doing.
It's the mindset mainly. So does that mean that countries with more money will be higher on the ranking because they have more money to spend and develop their country in this sector?
It is a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition. That is, you certainly need to invest money in the digital economy. But sometimes, if the mindset is not there, it is not successful. I give you one example. The IMD World Competitiveness Center is based in Switzerland. Switzerland is actually an advanced country in terms of digital transformation, but it has one problem, and the problem is that individuals are still very reluctant to embrace technology. For example,
why do you think that's the reason, though?
Well, so it's probably a socially conservative society when it comes to technology. In Switzerland, people are very reluctant to use e-commerce, for example, to buy books or food. In Switzerland, when people want to have banking services, they still want to go to a branch and talk to a real person. A penetration of e-banking in Switzerland is still marginal compared to countries like Thailand, for instance. And it's because culturally, the Swiss people, they are not adapted to technology yet. So despite the massive investment of the country in great technologies, it's not a country that is ahead, in digital transformation.
I see.
And on the contrary, you have countries where the technology is not there yet, but where people are extremely driven toward digital transformation. In our rankings this year, the best example is Eastern Europe, countries like Estonia or Hungary or Romania, where they are still investing in technology, but people are already way advanced.
Really?
in the
Like
usage.
we wouldn't expect that in Eastern Europe. We would expect that in Europe, like Switzerland.
Could be,
Yeah.
but remember in Eastern Europe they have traditionally extremely good education systems, and probably because of necessity, I think young people have learned to be demanding in terms of technology, and they are the most technology savvy in the world. Companies like Skype or voice data recognition or other new ventures that have been created in the world come from Eastern Europe. So innovation comes from this part of the world. Of course, because the technology then is not there, the technological infrastructure is not there, then companies from the West, like in the United States, Skype is bought by a Western company. Or for example, Spotify, which is another music service that was originated also in Estonia, ended up in the hands of American companies. So this lack of technological infrastructure makes talent useless sometimes. You need to combine both.
I see. So basically, these companies are known because the United States, people in the United States bought their company.
Exactly.
And then, people know about it. And what about in Asia? What are the countries that you think, are already well developed in this sector?
The most advanced country in digital transformation today is China. Not only in Asia, but worldwide.
Okay.
I think China, because they have massive resources, has invested massively on artificial intelligence, big data, quantum computing, digital transformation. China already launched 2 years ago the first quantum satellite to space.
Yeah.
And quantum computing is going to disrupt massively all our encryption systems, for example, and our banking systems. So China is definitely a pioneer. And as a result of that, geographically, all the countries in the neighbor of China, Thailand included, are also enjoying certain technological advantage.
What about the company like Alibaba, which is, well known in, their services? Does that also help China in this sector as well?
Alibaba is already one of the major providers of financial services to China. That is, Alibaba is not just an e-retailer as Amazon.com was 25 years ago. Alibaba is playing very strongly in the payment system area. And that's a good example on how China is now more developed than any country in Europe. Going to China now is truly amazing. I was in China a couple of months ago, and there you see already how the society is becoming cashless. That is using
I've heard as well
mobile,
about this. Yeah.
which is, given the development of the economy, is extremely surprising. And it's not just in the big cities. If you go to the rural areas in China, mobile payments are also very advanced because they lacked for many years the banking technology, and they have moved from having no banks at all to using Alipay as a means of payment. That's a shocking transition of a country.
I see. Well, now we have to take a short break, but when we come back, we'll talk more. Welcome back to the program. So now we're in our last break. So let's go back to the Competitiveness Yearbook report. As this year there is new countries added in your rankings, why are they just added this year? Why weren't they there before?
We only ranked 63 countries. And as you have said, this year we have added Mongolia and Saudi Arabia to the rankings, and actually Cyprus as well. So there are over the last couple of years. And we only include 63 countries in our study because we need to have access to good data, good quality data. There are some countries that do not provide the statistical information that is reliable. And we would like to rank 150 countries, but we cannot. In the case of Saudi Arabia or Cyprus, for example, that were added this year, we have been working with them in the last 2 or 3 to make sure that they collect the right information, that they have the good data services, and once we can prove that the data that we use is reliable, then they are included in the ranking.
I see. Because it's surprising, because Saudi Arabia, I assume that they would have, quite interesting economy in their country, and surprising that it's the first time they're in the ranking. And how are they doing in the ranking?
So Saudi Arabia, it was interesting when we started working with them because you could ask for unemployment data from 2 different government agencies and they would give you a different number. and it's because they were not coordinated. So
Yeah.
that was the problem. Saudi Arabia still ranks in the bottom half of our list this year, and it is because even though it is a productive economy, rich in natural resources,
And most of the people are rich as well there.
obviously
Yeah.
they have several problems. First of all, a massive unemployment problem, especially among the young people. Second, massive income inequalities, and third, a huge lack of diversification in the economy, which, unlike Thailand, is focused only on one single commodity, oil, and that's why Saudi Arabia, and we're working with them, is moving away from oil and diversifying into other industries, because that's the only way to preserve the future.
I see. What about Mongolia? I've heard from people that are interested in the economy and stuff that Mongolia is actually a rising star.
Yes.
So they've just been added this year. So how are they doing?
Yes, and I agree with you. It's a rising star, even though it is in the bottom 5 of the countries in our list of 63. Mongolia has, I think, to me, 2 very important assets. First of all, is very strong political leadership.
Okay.
To improve the competitiveness of the country. I mean, they came to us saying, we want to make our country more competitive, which is truly amazing.
Normally you approach the countries? Is that the process?
No, much more is that normally countries do not care. I mean,
Okay.
especially in Europe, for example, competitiveness is not one of the strongest points in the agenda. Okay? In Thailand it is.
Yeah.
In Taiwan or in Malaysia or in Singapore, competitiveness is important. But Mongolia, which is a much poorer country, said
And
we
small.
want, they said we want to be more competitive. So the first asset of Mongolia is an amazing political drive to make people better off. And second, of course, is natural resources. Mongolia now enjoys some of the largest copper reserves in the world that have been discovered recently. So the country has the means to invest in infrastructure and education. Unfortunately, copper prices have been declining, and that's why the country is now a little bit trapped. But it has, in my opinion, as you say, it's an amazing
potential,
future.
basically.
Great potential.
I see. So let's talk about the countries in the higher rankings. What makes them in that area, in that top list?
Yes, that's the most difficult question of today, because I tell you what, if you look at the top 10 countries in our ranking, there is nothing common among these countries.
Yeah.
So you have, for example, a large economy like the United States, but also small economies like Hong Kong and Singapore. You have exporting economies like Switzerland, but then you have also importing countries like the United States again. You have any type of political regime, you have any type of geography, you have very different business models. For example, in the United States or in Switzerland, the competitiveness model is driven by the private sector. In Switzerland there is no government to speak of, while in countries like Singapore or Hong Kong, then the main driver of the competitiveness of the country is the public sector. So there is no, as we always say, there is no common recipe for competitiveness. I think that if we go back to the beginning, we say good government, good private sector, and good infrastructure, we can possibly say that in all of these countries, to some extent, these 3 pillars are of a certain quality. Okay? Not a very extremely good quality, but at least they have some quality in the government, the private sector, and the infrastructure.
Well, I've noticed in your rankings that some countries dropped a lot in their ranking. Let's say like 5. Some of them dropped like 5 spots or 6 spots. What is the factor that determines that dropping?
Yes, obviously, if you look at the macro figures, you never see drastic deterioration in, let's say, GDP growth from one year to the other, unless there is a massive crisis. So when we observe big leaps in competitiveness, it's always driven to sentiment. That is, in our ranking, 1/3 of the indicators are collected from a survey that we conduct among executives in the country.
I see.
And very often, the sentiment in the country changes significantly from one year to the other.
Okay.
Either improves or deteriorates, and that improvement in the sentiment or deterioration drives the ranking to a great extent. Examples, for example, in the past year were Italy, where suddenly people's perception improved significantly, or this year Japan. In Japan, it's very, very significant to see that if you ask executives today relative to 5 years ago, they are much more optimistic about the economy. And we always feel that perception drives reality, especially with executives' opinions. Because if they're optimistic, then they will invest in the country, they will create jobs, they will improve the image of the country abroad, attract more investment from abroad, and overall the economy will grow.
I see.
So that perception is very often a good sign of the future.
So basically you're just saying that sometimes it's not about the economy overall, but also the perception of the executives in those countries as well. What's surprising, because people maybe not think about that point. They would look at the overall economy and then decide to invest. So it's a good factor to keep in mind what people are thinking inside the country as well.
We studied this a couple of years ago, and we found that the best predictor of competitiveness in the long run is the image of the country abroad.
I see.
That is, Thailand is a good example of a country that is improving its image abroad, and that is a great sign, because this perception again drives investment and attracts capital.
I see.
And very often we worry about the hard metrics. We need to invest more in bridges or in airports, but improving our image internally and externally is also very important.
I see. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for sharing your information. Thank you. ขอบคุณค่ะ The IMD World Competitiveness Yearbook is the leading annual report on the competitiveness of nations and has been published by the IMD since 1989. It benchmarks the performance of 63 countries based on more than 340 criteria, measuring different facets of competitiveness. And with the world economy changing at a fast pace and also with new trends always emerging, with this, the report series remains the most comprehensive assessment of national competitiveness nationwide as well as worldwide. And that's all the time we have for this episode. Thank you for tuning in. See you again next time. สวัสดีค่ะ